and right now 20 people waiting, so we'll see what that lands up. Yep. Hey everyone, welcome to this webinar, an ICPR 2022 preview. I'll let everybody sort of roll in, but good you're here. Today we're going to look ahead at ICPR and talk about the possible upcoming legalization of psychedelics. Depending on where you look and where you are, different developments are happening. I'm going to do that today with Mason Marks and Joost Breeksema, who I'll introduce pretty soon, a little bit more elaborately. Just to introduce, there's been such a amazing flight in the attention for psychedelics in recent years. I'm not sure if anybody has seen How to Change Your Mind on Netflix recently. Even a few years ago, when Michael Pollan launched his book, How to Change Your Mind, there's actually an interview with him on this channel. People in psychedelic science spoke of the Michael Pollan effect because there was so much attention coming up. And now there's even a Netflix show, and it's kind of incredible how mainstream it has become. So today, we'd like to talk about that, but also what's happening in Oregon. And that's why we invited Mason Marks. He's the senior fellow and project lead on the project on psychedelics law and regulation at Harvard Law School. And he used to chair the board's licensing subcommittee of the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, which advises the Oregon Health Authority on the creation of statewide psilocybin industries coming up. So Mason, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and also Joost Breeksema, who is the director of the Open Foundation. By night, I would say. By day, you're senior fellow, and you work at Groningen University as a researcher. What do you specifically research?
I do qualitative research at the Department of Psychiatry, where I am particularly interested in the experiences of patients who are being treated with different psychedelics for severe mental disorders.
Yeah, and you're also co-founder of the Open Foundation, and
yes.
Also the one of the initiators of the first ICPR, which happened in 2010. That
Correct.
Was the first ICPR, and this is the 5th that's coming up. So it's a cause for celebration. Definitely,
yeah, and this is our 15-year anniversary of Open as well.
Oh, great! And because the COVID one in 2020, like there was one planned. This whole thing got planned for 2020, and then it didn't happen because of COVID.
It did happen. Everything went online.
But then everything went online. So that was the 4th, and now the 5th is coming up. So thank you to you both, Mason. I would like to start with you to sort of first clear up what's happening or what has happened in Oregon. In 2020, Oregon voters approved a ballot legalizing psilocybin services, but there's been a lot of confusion about what that actually means. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit about what is it and what is it not?
Yeah, and it's great to be here because I won't be able to make it to Harlem this year, so I'm glad to get a chance to chat with you. So yeah, there has been a lot of confusion around Measure 109, the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act, which we're about 3 months now from the Oregon Health Authority starting to accept applications for licenses in that program. So that's really exciting. In January, they'll start accepting licenses for psilocybin manufacturers and testing labs and facilitators and service centers. And I think where some of the confusion arises is what exactly does this law do and what is its purpose? And part of that probably stems from the way that this Measure 109 has been promoted. A lot of people refer to it as legalizing psilocybin therapy, and they use therapy in a very colloquial way. But really, what this bill does is legalizes psilocybin services, which is not therapy. It allows people to access psilocybin for any reason. It could be for spiritual or religious purposes, for recreational purposes. They just want to have a profound experience or try out psilocybin and see what it's like. And they have to do that at a psilocybin service center under the supervision of a licensed psilocybin facilitator. And so some people have been describing this, especially the media, as legalizing psilocybin therapy, which gives the impression that it's a medical intervention. But due to the language of the law, it actually prohibits people from practicing medicine within these service centers. They can't be diagnosing and treating mental health conditions.
So how would you call it?
I like to refer to it as supported adult use. And that's because the recreational cannabis laws in the US are often described as adult use, where people can just go to a dispensary, purchase cannabis, and then go home. But I call it supported adult use because here they can't do that. They have to go to the service center and actually stay there while they experience the effects of psilocybin.
So does that mean that there will be some sort of centers that there will probably be a development of centers coming up where you will have to go to experience this?
Yeah, there will be licensed centers. That's one of the 4 license types that the state health authority will issue. And we don't really know exactly how many there will be in Oregon. The health authority just issued the latest draft of some of its rules for licensing specifically. And we saw, among many other things, how much it will cost to license these service centers. And the licensing fees are very high. So service centers will pay an annual $10,000 licensing fee, as will the manufacturers and the testing labs. And the facilitators will pay an annual $2,000 fee. If the centers are nonprofit, that gets cut in half to $5,000. But all facilitators will pay $2,000 unless they qualify for an exemption by either being a veteran or by receiving certain types of public assistance, like Social Security income, for example. So those are very high fees. I'm not sure exactly how the health authority came up with them. It's significantly higher than what a doctor or a lawyer would pay each year in Oregon to maintain their licenses. But that indicates to me potentially that the health authority might think that there might not be a lot of these centers because the fees have to pay for the cost of administering the program. And if they thought there were going to be hundreds of centers, then perhaps the fees might have been a little bit lower.
Is there a way for these centers to already start or make themselves known, or are they already developing?
They can't officially get started. I mean, you could always. There are stories of people purchasing land. The company Synthesis, for example, which is
the Netherlands,
a Dutch company, they purchased a large plot of land in Ashland, Oregon, in the south of the state. For I think it was about $3 million, 2.5 or 3.5 million, I can't remember, to open some kind of a retreat. So people are investing a lot of money in property, and that could be a little bit premature because we don't even know which counties in the state will opt out of the program. There are some counties that are trying to, under this particular law, they can choose to opt out. And then if they do, the voters have to vote on that. It goes back to the ballot. So potentially there could be some areas that opt out. And so you wouldn't, if you live in one of those areas and you purchased a property with that intention, you could be out of luck. But people are pursuing it.
Yeah, of course. Joost, I'd like to ask you a question.
Can I ask a question to Mason first?
Of course, you can. That was just, of course, anything goes.
Just out of curiosity, because I know
Yeah,
you're talking about psilocybin. Is this actually synthetic psilocybin, or does the law also pertain to psilocybin containing mushrooms or other parts of the organism?
So the law does allow for synthetic as well as naturally derived psilocybin. However, the advisory board that met for the past 2 years approximately decided to recommend that synthetic be left off the table, at least for now. And the health authority adopted that recommendation. So at least initially and for the foreseeable future, only naturally derived psilocybin will be available. But if you look at these rules, they have adopted measurements like milligrams, and some of the packaging requirements require servings to be individually packaged. So every single serving has to be individually packaged. So the rules don't really lend themselves very well to like consuming whole mushrooms. So it's a little unclear to the extent that that will be feasible under these rules.
So
yeah, because that would require. Sorry for taking taking over your role.
That's fine.
That would require testing facilities, obviously, as well, and standardized production of organic products, which is obviously very hard to do.
Yeah, I think they've been trying to really standardize things as much as possible, standardize the dose as much as possible. Personally, I don't know. I don't know how important that is in every case. I think some people might want to just take some mushrooms and understand dose will be a little more variable, but I think that's the intent behind the rules.
Is there anything that the law says about just the possession of mushrooms or psilocybin?
Yeah, so the Measure 109 law that we're talking about does not allow for any kind of possession, manufacturing, or sales outside of the regulated system. But Oregon does have a separate law that was passed at the same time by voters, Measure 110, which does partially decriminalize psilocybin possession and possession of most illicit drugs below certain limits, so personal use limits. So the penalty, which used to be a misdemeanor, is then reduced to a fine.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that Oregon and the Netherlands have in common. One thing is that I lived in both. That's just one thing. But Joost, what sort of differences do you see between what you've just heard and what the Netherlands already has or might develop?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I think the way that psychedelic use is regulated in the Netherlands is by not really regulating it at all, unless in some aspects there are measures of self-regulation at play, but the extent to which it's being regulated from above, really a top-down approach whereby the state determines who is eligible to experiment with mushrooms, that's a really big distinction. And it's interesting because I am all in favor of regulating. I think we need to find proper ways of integrating the use of the safe and responsible and adult use of psychedelics in societies. But the way that Oregon is doing it is by really creating a set of predetermined rules and criteria, whereas in the Netherlands, we've had really unregulated use for I don't know how long, 20, 25 years through the sale in smart shops. And even smart shops that they were unregulated in the sense that there were no age limits. So if you're 15, especially 15, 20 years ago, you could just go inside a smart shop, buy mushrooms, and then go home and take it with your friends. And even this use, interestingly, has led to relatively little incidents. I mean, we can talk about the way that mushrooms became scheduled in the Netherlands.
I would like to do that after Mason leaves. Actually, was part of the plan.
Yes, of course, in no worries. Yeah.
I was too close to that. So,
but I think that's an important distinction.
It might help to clarify that. So as of today, there is still a thing called truffles, but it's actually the sclerotia. It's more like a food storage of the same organism that is still legally sold in these smart shops. And this means that psilocybin containing products are indeed tolerated, allowed, for all intents and purposes, legal in the Netherlands. And it seems like a lot of the therapy has been derived from that. So a lot of the therapy centers that have come up in recent years seem to have sort of built themselves around this, let's call it a loophole. It's a little bit of a loophole, but it's, like you said, it's not a well-regulated system that was built. Mason, I wanted to ask you, what was sort of you had on one hand the ballot that had certain wording. On the other hand, you had wishes by maybe the industry or the government. What were sort of like the pros and cons, the things that you had to debate on the board? What were the discussions?
You know, interestingly, I would often bring up the Netherlands as an example where these truffles are available, very freely available. People walk into a store, they don't have to provide any information when they do that. And yet, even the government, which has studied this, and I usually share a study that came out of the Dutch Ministry of Health, which found that there were negligible risks. It did not seem to impact public health or safety, but they did actually mention in this study that it would be interesting to have a sort of a supported adult use model. So it's kind of interesting that they mentioned it. And this was, I think it was like around 2011, so it was a while ago. But there were many disagreements on the board. I think that some people were in favor of even more intense regulation and kind of requiring very, very detailed medical screenings to screen certain people out, and defining lists of contraindications that would either disqualify people from participating or require them to seek the expertise of healthcare professionals before participating. In the current rules, the draft rules, which are not yet finalized, it seems like the health authority has not gone in that direction and has adopted fairly minimal, a fairly minimal floor for the screening requirements. But it seems like a service center could implement potentially additional screening. So I imagine that will be something that's discussed as people make public comments on these rules. And I think that requiring too much screening really takes this program out of the supported adult use, the scope of supported adult use, and starts to push it more in a medical direction that might even not be allowed under the measure, the way that it's written. There were also people that were very concerned about cost and equity in accessibility, not only to the psilocybin services, but to the industry as well. And I would say that those issues were not really emphasized as much as safety. And I think some people had the view that cost and accessibility were not quite as much within the mandate of that board and the health authority. So the majority of the focus has been on safety, as it should be, but perhaps these other issues like accessibility and also really promoting the long history of use of psilocybin, ensuring that there's a diversity of approaches to how these service centers operate. It could have been given more attention, but they certainly did put a lot of focus on safety, as they should.
And did they put a lot of focus on aftercare, or is that not in the?
So that's a very interesting question. The Oregon law, for example, as is common to do in the medical context, and in less formal kind of underground circles as well, breaks these services into three phases: the preparation phase, the administration phase, and the integration phase. So integration is kind of what you're talking about, right? Where
absolutely,
you kind of process this experience afterwards. In Oregon, that phase is optional, and I do think that concerned some people who probably would have preferred to make that mandatory or build it out in some ways. And if you look at Colorado's bill for comparison, the integration is required. I actually don't agree with that. I think I understand the motivation for it is good. The intention is right, but I think that it's kind of over-regulating a bit and requiring, it's probably raising the costs in the long run.
You mentioned Colorado. Some developments are happening there as well. I understand you're not as much as an expert on that locale as you are in Oregon, but do you know a little bit about when any of this might happen in Oregon or in Colorado?
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to be as up on Colorado as much as I can, because that really could be the next epicenter of psychedelics in the United States. They have a new bill called the Natural Medicine Health Act. It's a ballot initiative that Colorado voters will consider in November. So very soon, less than 2 months. And so it's also called Proposition 122. And what it does is it creates a regulated system like in Oregon. And then alongside that, it also decriminalizes 5 psychedelic substances, although 2 of them are psilocybin and psilocin. So it's really like 4. And initially, the regulated system would only provide psilocybin, like in Oregon, but it includes an option for the board that will be formed and the authority, the government authority, which is called DORA in Oregon or in Colorado, to add some other substances like ibogaine and dimethyltryptamine to the substances that could be provided in these healing centers. They call them healing centers instead of service centers. Now, if you look at the title of the bill, Natural Medicine Health Act, and a lot of the language being used, healing centers, I think this is a much more medically oriented bill, and the drafters are trying to overcome some of the obstacles that prevented medicalizing the services in Oregon. So it's a little bit unclear exactly whether people will be able to access psilocybin for any reason the way that they can in Oregon. And there's also a lot more left to the government agency to work out in Colorado than in Oregon. So it's a little less clear what the final product will be once it's implemented. If it passes in November, there's a 1.5-year development period instead of the 2-year period. So probably they're hoping to build on some of the knowledge that was built up in Oregon and get a little bit of a head start.
Interesting. Joost?
Yeah, no, it also sounds a little bit because of the probably deliberate vagueness in Colorado that they veer also at the same time a little bit more towards indigenous traditional use. It's the natural medicine and healing centers. They're not hospitals, right? So it sounds a little bit like they're trying to steer in that direction at the same time. Is that my impression, or am I totally wrong?
I think that might be an impression that is desirable to put out there. I'm not sure that's the reality of if you really dig into the details, I think that would be a somewhat optimistic interpretation. I mean, I hope that's the case, but just based on the way that it's structured. So another one of the controversies in Oregon was whether to take this, break it into 2. So you'd have 2 tiers of licenses, a top tier for people with healthcare backgrounds and licenses, and a lower tier for everyone else. That didn't work because the Oregon doesn't allow for it. Colorado does that though. It's going to have two tiers. It could have multiple tiers depending on the training of the facilitators. And there are just a lot of little details in it that suggest to me that it's even referred to as therapy by the campaign. They say it's not for recreational use. At first, I thought they meant that there won't be dispensaries, but I think in some people's minds, they really mean there's no recreational use. So we could see more restrictive access requirements.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, and then because they're also you're hinting at including ibogaine. That was a surprise to me, because that's you're in a whole different ballgame. There's a very different risk profile for ibogaine than any of the other psychedelics, really.
No. Joost, when you hear these different models, so to speak, could you comment on which one is farthest ahead now? Then,
I mean.
And what does that mean, maybe?
That's a very broad question. I think in terms of, I'm not entirely sure. I think Oregon, I think many different places in the world are looking at Oregon, the way that they're going to implement this, and indeed how it will impact accessibility. I think that's an important question, because as I said before, the unregulated or the self-regulated use of psilocybin in the Netherlands has been really unproblematic. And even you mentioned earlier the therapy centers, but they're not therapy centers. They don't call themselves therapy centers. So the retreat centers, the guides, the facilitators, who hold these sessions, they try and self-regulate themselves as well and hold each other accountable too. So there are organizations forming, supporting each other, forming guidelines, drafting ethical principles, and supporting each other in that way. So in that sense, I think that's one direction that is kind of developing. But it's odd. I mean, we are talking about the use of psilocybin containing mushrooms in the Netherlands and the US, whereas there are traditions that have been using these plants for centuries, millennia in some cases. So, I mean, obviously those are very well established and integrated, and they have a very specific role and function and purpose. And it's very clear who is allowed to use it under which circumstances and guided by whom. Yeah. And that's something that we're in our Western countries are trying to figure out right now, which is very interesting. But I mean, if you take a step back and look at where it's most well advanced, it's obviously in those cultures.
Yeah, yeah, from a cultural standpoint. Yeah, and Mason also mentioned that it called it a more medical system for Colorado, for example. Can you explain a little bit what is the advantage or the disadvantage of medicalizing, and what does that actually mean?
You're asking me?
Also,
I was asking Joost actually. Sorry.
Oh
Mason.
yeah,
and then you can comment.
I'll just say there are some states that are taking a very, very medical approach we can talk about. But,
and what does that mean? Maybe you can define it first, and then Joost can comment on what's good or bad about it.
In that case, I just mean that. Well, I'll let Joost answer, but in that case, I mean that only it's very clear that only doctors can provide it. So New York is an example. Mm-hmm. There's a couple bills that have been proposed in New York.
Only doctors can have it. And then Joost, the question is, what's good or bad about sort of controlling who can administer it and who cannot, and where do you see that going, also from the discussions you've heard here on this side of the pond?
I mean, this is obviously a very important discussion, and I think medicalization is a very positive process in itself. I think I'm all in favor of clinical research into therapeutic applications of psilocybin, because there is obviously a huge need. 25 to 30% of people with mental disorders become treatment resistant, or they don't respond to any of the conventional treatments anymore. And these are the people who suffer the most, whose families, whose surroundings suffer the most. Society as a whole suffers from this. So I think it's hugely important that there is a medical approach. I just think that a medical approach shouldn't exclude other legitimate uses of psychedelics. I think there are equally legitimate reasons for people who want to use psilocybin or whatever substance we're talking about for religious purposes or for exploratory purposes, for curiosity, for self-exploration. And even the word recreational, God forbid that people have fun. I think people should be allowed to use psilocybin recreationally if that means they want to have fun. I don't think that's the best use necessarily, but I also don't want to impose my value system on what other people decide to do. As long as they're well-informed, well-educated, they're responsible adults. I think as long as a medical model or a medicalization approach doesn't mean that all these other legitimate uses are excluded, then I'm all for it.
And it seems like, thanks, interesting. And it seems like Mason, that Oregon gives a little bit more leeway to this. It gives a little bit more options than just doctors, right?
Yeah, I really could not agree more with that sentiment about medical use. Medical research and use is so important, and it's essential to expanding our understanding of what these substances can do. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of stakeholders think about it in a very black and white way. It's either medical use or it's recreational, which is usually used pejoratively to kind of put it down, like it's reckless or something like that. And so I think you have to have both equally respected and represented. And I totally forgot your question because I was so enamored with what Joost just said.
Oh, it's more it's funny because now I have forgot the question.
That's okay.
So he says, my question was more that if I understand these different models now separately, it seems like Oregon gives a model that is both regulated yet also gives room for more than just this medical way.
Yeah. I think Oregon, the law has its problems, but it was the first time people took a stab at creating a regulated system like that. It certainly could have a lot of things to put in to ensure equity. Like you cannot have administration outside of the service centers. That's something that
administration. So
Correct.
if somebody says, I want to leave, I want to go home. I mean,
oh, that's another question. That's very interesting. So I'll touch on that. What I'm referring to is if a person is so ill that they can't leave home, or they're in a hospice facility, they can't go to the service center. If they're in their deathbed or something, I mean, they can't travel to the service center. They're not able to receive psilocybin in Oregon under these rules. So in Washington, there's a bill under consideration that I helped draft portions of. It's based largely on Measure 109, but that was one of the changes we put in so that you could have home administration if someone could not travel to the center. That was a big question that came up on the board. What happens if someone wants to leave after an hour or two, right? And there were very in-depth discussions that you don't want to restrain people when they're under the influence of psilocybin. We can't have facilitators locking the door, strapping people down, or that's going to cause so much trauma and harm. So there was a rule put into this client bill of rights that came out of the licensing committee that I ran, and I think it's great. And one of the parts of this bill of rights says that clients can end the session if they want to early. They can't be held there against their will. But you have to balance that, of course, with safety considerations. And so in the current draft of the rules that the health authority put out, there were clients, which is what we call the people using the services in Oregon, the clients have to have a transportation plan that describes how they're going to get home after the session. And there's a rule that's a little bit concerning in the current version that says that the facilitator must call the police immediately if the client is not following the transportation plan and endangers themselves or other people. And so my concern is just that that's going to be very difficult for facilitators to interpret. What exactly does that mean? If someone's just going to walk home a few blocks, they didn't have a high dose. I've explained that people do that in the Netherlands all the time, right? They go to Vondel Park and they
that's
take
what everybody does.
Truffles, right?
To the dunes, yeah.
So where do you draw the line? I think there needs to be a lot more fleshing that out, because you don't want people calling 911 and having police show up in the middle of a session. That's just going to be really bad for everyone involved.
Well, it's already progress that we're at least talking about it. So that's that things like this might be happening. Can you put a date on any of this?
Oh, you mean like when these decisions will be?
When is the first service center opening? That's
a great question. So no one knows that for sure. The licenses will start being accepted by the health authority January 2nd, but I've heard all kinds of estimates of when people will actually be able to walk into a center, and I think most people I've heard say the second half of next year.
So just maybe I missed this, but who determines who can become a facilitator?
That's another great question. So the facilitators have to pass a licensing exam that's administered by the health authority. We don't know anything about the exam other than the fact that it will be administered online. You can retake it after 48 hours if you fail. You can take it at home, at least under the draft rules. It'll be available in different languages and accessible for people with disabilities, things like that. We don't really know exactly what it's going to look like though. So that's that. Passing that exam with a score of 75 or higher out of 100, I guess, and completing one of the approved training programs are the two requirements to become
Okay.
a facilitator.
I was going to say, like, passing an exam, that sounds like a a very minimal standard, but so there are approved training centers.
There are approved programs already. And I will say that though the law says that you only need a high school education or equivalent to become a facilitator, a lot of the programs that I've seen, the training programs, are not admitting people who don't have a healthcare background. So in some ways, though the law is not keeping people with less education out, the training programs are sort of acting as gatekeepers in that sense.
Interesting. And the Oregon Health Authority is, I guess, in the end, the one responsible for implementing all of this.
Yep.
Yep. Mason, thank you so much. I know that you need to jump off. So thanks so much for all this info. And we'll see you digitally at ICPR.
I have so many more questions.
Well,
let's keep talking. This has been a real pleasure.
Same.
It's so great to chat with both of you. So let's do it again soon.
Yes, let's
Likewise.
do this. Hey, thank you, Mason.
Thanks.
Bye. And Joost, we'll keep chatting for a little bit. I'd like to know a little bit more about what's going on, more on the scientific field in the Netherlands specifically. But I think it would first be nice to sort of get our attention a little bit to ICPR. I'll share my screen because over here is the website of the live stream tickets of ICPR. So the actual conference is sold out in person, the in-person conference, which is amazing. So congratulations, Joost.
Yeah, it's a pity we have a waiting list, and it's really a pity that we can't allow more people.
Right? Yeah, it's unfortunate, but
there are physical limits to how many people we can have.
Right, it's a fire department thing now. It's like we can start getting fines if we start accepting more people. But the great thing is that we do have live stream tickets. We built a new community platform on Circle, and you'll be able to visit that. You can connect with like-minded people who are also interested in psychedelics. The people are at the conference itself in person. We'll be on this platform as well, so you still have the same vibe of being at the conference. I know it's not going to be the same thing. I'm not going to lie. Like being at an actual conference, especially after a couple of years of COVID, is going to be great. But I think this is actually a really great deal because you also get, with a live stream ticket, you get 3 months of access to the Open Foundations community platform, which gives access to all the talks from 2016 and talks from 2020. So you'll have days and days on end worth of scientific information about psychedelics and psychedelic science.
Yes, and I mean, just in community. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's nothing like a physical conference, but I do also know that there are people who are intimidated by large groups of people, which I also understand. And just having access to a community of like-minded people, of fellow researchers, enthusiasts, therapists, is also something that I think is super valuable. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's what I also love about the fact that we have live stream tickets is that we can more easily invite people from all over the world, which is also really great, which is really something that COVID, of course, opened up for the first time for ICPR, that we could easily give access to people from the global south, for example.
Absolutely.
And that you can share this knowledge so much more easily.
And I must say, despite the previous one being a virtual conference, it was still a lot of fun.
It was, right? Yeah,
it was.
Yeah, yeah. It was hosting. It was fun. We ran it from a house, from a huge house from one of the open members, volunteers, and still it felt we had a lot of these after chats also online, which were really really nice. A lot of new connections were made. So there is a special coupon code that you can use. It's in the description of this video, so be sure to check that out. The coupon is OpenLive40. So if you use that on live stream tickets for ICPR, so if you go tickets on the ICPR website and you find the live stream ticket over here, and you register and you fill it out in, it's probably good to see over here. If you fill out the coupon code OpenLive40, open here, let's not make typos, then it won't work. You'll see that you get a €40 discount.
How do you know it works?
It doesn't. Yeah, I'm glad that it works. You never know. But so I want to implore everybody watching this to do so and get access to so many speakers. And I wanted to ask you, Joost, which speakers are you most looking forward to? Because the list this year is pretty insane, and impressive.
So maybe just because maybe we ended a little abruptly when Mason left.
Of course.
There's so much more to be discussed, and I think this topic will be explored in much more detail by specific people, in specific tracks. You personally will moderate a track on the mainstreaming of psychedelics, where we go much dive into much more detail on how these models can be complementary or whether they actually bite each other, whether there's a conflict there. But yeah,
I still want to know which speakers you are looking forward to, though.
Oh man,
just a few.
So okay, one of the people that I'm very happy will speak at the conference is Bernardo Kastrup, who's a hardcore physicist but also a philosopher. And he's a very critical thinker. He's very smart. He's an active proponent of the idea of metaphysical idealism. So the theory that the foundation of our reality is actually consciousness. It's not matter. And he has physical or physicalist evidence for this. He has philosophical assertions to found this on, but he will also talk about what we can learn from psychedelic research, neuroscientific research, and how this can help our understanding of consciousness and the material or idealist foundation of consciousness. So this is a little bit of a niche topic maybe, but I think this will already be one of my favorite lectures.
I think so too. There's actually a profile about all of this coming out on the Open Foundation website next week. By Stefan. Yeah, by Stefan. He wrote a big piece about it. Bernardo Kastrup is incredible. I think it's actually great about ICPR that it's interdisciplinary and that you can get all these different angles on it, because somebody like Bernardo Kastrup is so valuable to know. I already never forgot, like a few weeks ago, I was watching something and he said, reality is basically mathematical formulas floating through empty space. And it's very true. We are basically and they have very complicated mathematical formulas and you have very simple mathematical formulas. And I was like, that's a mind-blowing way to look at all of this. So that's a short little ICPR preview.
So that's one thing. And you said interdisciplinary, but what I also like, and it's kind of weird to say this about your own conference, but what I like, what I personally enjoy is that you can go to lectures presenting just data, just new studies. We have all of most of the recent clinical trials will be presented at ICPR. 5-MeO-DMT or DMT for depression, the recent psilocybin assisted therapy for alcoholism that came out, a few tracks about psilocybin for depression. There have been a couple of different trials at Imperial, at Johns Hopkins, the Compass trial. The results will be presented there. They haven't been published yet.
Because it's kind of this kind of will tie into what we're gonna fill the rest of the hour with. It's a little bit about science has been progressing a lot, but there are clinical studies that have very select small groups of people to get sort of scientific answers, which is wholly different from sort of the private industry that we just talked about in the first half hour, which is a more mainstream sort of thing. Can you talk a little bit about these differences and what's already happening and where that is going and how many people are actually in there? Because it's the group of people who is in there is also different from all the people that we talked about earlier. Can you maybe explain a little bit?
You're talking about when you say industry, do you mean the folks running retreat centers?
Yes. But I don't have the language. I don't have the right language yet to sort of like get all these all these different concepts separated well.
The thing is, industry. I mean, this is a word that I now regularly use, and which I wasn't accustomed to 2 years ago even. But industry typically in psychiatry or medical science refers to the pharmaceutical industry, all of the whole ecosystem that makes it possible to conduct clinical research. And then industry refers to the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech startups that are, and that's not the industry that you mean.
No, I think anybody who made this their job, their sort of like legal job, anybody who works in the industry is sort of anybody who now works with psychedelics, I would say. That's how I would determine it, because I've described it as an ecosystem also a few times, because it is kind of a complex ecosystem of foundations, organizations trying to convince universities and research groups to take something up, to then, with those results, go to a health inspection or authority or ministry to get rules for a wider private field to develop. Is that a more accurate description?
No, I think you're mixing up a few things. So there are a couple of different things. So one of the initiatives that I'm involved in is about getting all of the different bodies together, and I'll explain a little bit what I mean. All the different stakeholders, and it's an ugly word that I don't like using, but it's useful here, who have something to do with the introduction of new treatments or therapies in the healthcare system. And what we're trying to do is to get everybody together. And this includes indeed regulatory agencies, those responsible for licensing new medicines, professional associations, so the bodies that evaluate and supervise clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, medical doctors, psychiatrists, etc. Healthcare insurance companies, the companies overseeing the healthcare insurers, the mental health institutions, the university medical centers, the pharmaceutical companies, all of the stakeholders that are currently involved or that will be involved when psychedelics eventually become registered, and that they need to be brought on board, because I think psychedelics, and we touch upon this, but it's good to make it explicit. It's not about administering a medicine. It's about administering a therapy that is catalyzed or that is facilitated by the use of a psychedelic.
It's an experience.
It's an experience, and the experience is instrumental. It's not the end goal. It's not, and most people will know this or will agree with it. It's not about giving a capsule containing 25 milligrams of psilocybin to an individual, and then even if you supervise them, then that's it. I think it's about the therapeutic process.
Yeah.
And this is new.
Yeah.
This is not something that we're used to dealing with in the healthcare system. And there's kind of a parallel here, which is, the analogy is maybe not ideal, but in the early 2000s, we did a couple of trials with heroin for people with serious heroin use,
serious addiction. People who tried to quit but couldn't, could get from the government free heroin. Basically, that's the program you're referring to, I guess.
Yes, to the medicinal heroin, and the analogy is correct in the sense that heroin is also a substance scheduled in our Opium Act, so our drug laws, and it's, I mean, it didn't happen overnight. There are strict rules about who can administer heroin. It has to be done in a supervised facility. There has to be health staff on board. People will have to remain on the facility, on the premises, for a certain period of time to avoid people overdosing on the streets or mixing with other substances that can mitigate, that can exacerbate their health situation.
Gladly, psychedelics are not heroin, so
exactly, that's where the analogy goes wrong. But what I mean to say is that there are some examples of licensing a medicine, but then also imposing criteria on who is allowed to administer the medicine, under what conditions, by such and such staff that have to be trained, that have to have this and this training, and that are supervised by a professional body that holds them accountable. And something similar but different will need to happen for psychedelics to be introduced in the healthcare system. And I think the idea behind our initiative is to get everybody on board before the first clinical trials are finalized, before they're wrapped up and need to be regulated by the medicines agencies, because then all of a sudden they will be available. And then how are we dealing with it? I think it's better to preempt this and to get everybody on the same page and to draft rules and criteria similar to what they're doing in Oregon, but then really focused on their use for the treatment of severe mental disorders.
And only for the treatment of severe mental disorders in that specific
yeah.
So where does that leave the private guides field then? Is it because it's already available in smart shops, psilocybin or mushrooms, that you don't need to, and that you can just do self-regulation for that market, so to speak?
It's an interesting question. So far, yes. I mean, I don't think we explained exactly what happened or what is the situation around psilocybin. So if you look at our drug act, psilocybin is in the UN conventions on drug use, and therefore also in the Netherlands is in the strictest category in our list 1, which also contains heroin or MDMA or cocaine.
Cannabis oil.
Cannabis oil, yeah, let's not even confuse people with cannabis, because that's has a similar weird status.
Yeah.
But yeah, so psilocybin and psilocin, or psilocin as Mason referred to it as, are in list 1. But then in 2007, we had a famous case where a 17-year-old French girl died, allegedly after having taken mushrooms, which she probably had bought in a smart shop. We don't know. There was no toxicology report that confirmed that she had actually taken mushrooms. And she may have killed herself. She may have had an accident. She may or may not have taken mushrooms. It's uncertain.
Yeah.
But the international pressure caused our industry.
I have a small little anecdote that I want to share about that, because I got to see it from very, very up close. I'm not even sure do you know this story? So I worked at the news desk of a small student organization called Campus TV, which is making stories for a newspaper that's already died long ago, which is called The Pers. And at some point, somebody had found out. I once dove into what happened exactly, but somebody at their news desk had found out that this had happened. So it was through regular news, like, hey, suicide, probably something to do with mushrooms. Then a colleague of mine and another colleague of mine got in touch with the parents of this girl. And I think they actually even drove over to France to get the video and get a quote from them. And the quote was something along the lines like, "We hold the Dutch government responsible for the death of our daughter."
Yeah,
that was the quote they came home with, and it was sort of a done deal. That guy is now, by the way, he's head news of the largest newspaper of the Netherlands. So it gives you great success to find controversies like that. I made this all happened at the news desk I worked at, which was responsible for blowing it up to a national scandal. My videos about how to grow mushrooms yourself at home did not help at all. What was crazy about the whole episode, I found, was that all government research into the question, should we ban mushrooms, came back with, please don't. This is not causing any trouble. Please don't do this. This is nonsense. This is politics. And so the minister still did it. And
that's interesting, because Mason referred to a scientific paper, and I know the one that he's talking about, which was based on a committee commissioned by the Ministry of Health that did a risk assessment, which they usually do if they're scheduling new psychoactive drugs.
Yep.
They did a risk assessment, and they basically said that the risks of mushroom use are negligible with the exception of a specific location and a specific group of people, and that was tourists in Amsterdam.
That's
and
what
this,
they said.
yeah, and well, I mean, maybe this is too
And
much
so
detail.
one of no, I think it's
But
interesting
just-
because
just
it
to-
gives it gives a good image of the market. The mayor of Amsterdam back then, as an alternative, said, "What if we ask tourists to have a 24-hour waiting period?" Which is a very small little rule that they could have used to sort of mitigate for these things, but they chose the nuclear option, which was interesting because then in the end, that's why it's good to know. They forbade the mushroom, the fruiting body of the organism, but not the food storage part or the rest of the organism, and that's what then was marketed as truffles, these sclerotia, and that's why we still have
truffles back then also.
What they called truffles before, yeah. So that's just the people that's made them, right? Who came up with
Yeah, so the mushrooms
not really
ended up
truffles.
in a different part of the opium law, of the Opium Act, and the truffles were completely unregulated. So the psilocybin, depending on how and what form it is scheduled in 3 different ways. And the fact that truffles are completely unregulated, they're the same organism, they're just a different part of the organism, the part that grows below ground, as opposed to the fruiting body that grows, that's visible to most people. Yeah. And that's what's allowed this whole space of retreat centers and truffle facilitators to emerge.
Yeah, and that's what we still have, and that's why the Netherlands is sort of has developed a gigantic field for it as well. It's even so that the Dutch minister is has endorsed psychedelic science in a certain way as well, and its new government, our new government, is working on a research into the medical application of MDMA specifically. And I see a comment about MDMA here as well. Can we just, for the end of this webinar, can we just touch on what's happening around MDMA? Because we talked about psilocybin a lot. What's happening in the Netherlands? What's happening in the States? And where is this going?
So, well, MDMA, the second phase 3 trial has...
The second phase 3 trial.
Yes, sorry, that's complicated, eh? So phase 3 is typically the final phase before medicines become will be evaluated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, or the EMA, the European Medicines Agency in Europe, before they evaluate the data and decide whether or not to allow this new medicine to be registered and enter the market. And there's been a first phase 3 trial that's been published. The second phase 3 trial has been wrapped up, as far as I know. So I think it is being analyzed and written up. Then it will be submitted to the FDA that will look at the data to see how safe and effective these treatments are. And then the interesting question, and then that's really where I'm very curious to find out exactly how this will happen. And I know that MAPS, the organization that has supported all of this research, they are in close contact with the FDA. But then the FDA will say, okay, we'll allow MDMA, probably, because the results have been pretty impressive. And then it's up to the FDA or another body to decide who can then administer MDMA-assisted therapy. And that's something that doesn't really have a process yet.
And
so
there's room for is there room for politics there as well?
I think this I am hopeful that this will stay out of the realm of politics. The strategic thing has been to conduct a lot of this research on veterans and people who are beyond reproach, at least in the US. And they have a huge number of traumatized veterans, many of whom aren't helped by current treatments, which means that there is a huge need, and I don't think it will be stopped, especially because this is a therapeutic application. But we at ICPR will have a webinar. Not a webinar. These are actual people in an actual room who will discuss what the regulatory process in Europe will be like. So we'll hear from people involved in the European Research Council. We have a representative from the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, who is aware of this. the agency is. So they will. I'm very curious to see what they will say about how psychedelic therapies, so this combination of medicine and therapy, will be regulated.
Yeah, it seems like MDMA. There's been discussion in the Netherlands also about the legalization of recreational MDMA, which is, it's too politically polarized right now to go anywhere, I think. But this is still the route that seems to be going somewhere. It's just that Rick Dublin, who is one of the pater familias of all of this, I think back in the day he said 2023, then 2025, now it's 2035 or something like that. It seems like these studies are still a bit open-ended, and people should not get their, when it comes to MDMA at least, not get their hopes up that it's going to be a quick deal.
In the US, I think by next year or the year after, MDMA-assisted therapy will be registered, and it will be available for the treatment of PTSD. And it's very
specifically. So it's very specific for that. So for veterans, that will be an amazing, or anybody with PTSD, that will be an amazing thing.
Yeah, and then the next question becomes: is it possible to administer MDMA off-label? So so the label is PTSD. So will be, and there are provisions that allow for off-label administration of medications. If there is any evidence to support that it may be helpful. So people with a terminal illness, for example, or people with very severe mental disorders who have no other recourse, will they have access to off-label MDMA-assisted psychotherapy? And I mean, I think that's the next big question, because the rest of the clinical research that will have to be done for other indications as well.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for all of this. I wanted to just go back to ICPR one last time, because the first ICPR that I visited was 2016, and I still remember that our discussions about sort of how boring and legitimate everything had to look. It seems like so much has happened in those six years already, and I hope that you can see it, that you can see this in the program itself. Has the program broadened up, or how do you look at it? What's different this year?
I mean, we still emphasize serious, rigorous science. We have a serious review process before for the submission of abstracts, as other scientific conferences do. So we do still have that focus. But the fact that we've now added a day before ICPR to focus on the intersection between science and ethics and business. So what happens when all of these business interests come into academia? How do you deal with this? How does the inflow of money, which obviously helps researchers conduct more research and do research into different substances? Well, at ICPR we'll have clinical trials on DMT for depression, 5-MeO-DMT for depression, methadone. I mean, there's a host of different psychedelics or pseudo psychedelics or entheogens being investigated, and that's definitely new. Until a few years ago, it was psilocybin, MDMA, some LSD in Switzerland, but that definitely has broadened up. And I know there were
many more substances.
Yeah, there are many different substances, and we're very focused. We're talking a lot about the clinical part of it, but we are an interdisciplinary conference, so there's lots of room for discussions around ethics, around sociology, about the discourse around psychedelics, critical reflections.
Neurology? Is there neurology and philosophy?
There's philosophy, there's anthropology, there's neuroscience.
Yeah, is the neuroscience? Is there? Do you know if it's of neuroscience?
Of course.
Yeah.
There's
do you know a name?
Sorry.
Can you give us a name?
I mean, one of the big names doing neuroscience or pharmacological research is actually more pharmacology than neuroscience, probably. David Nichols, the founder of the Hefter Research Institute. I think one of the silent forces behind a lot of the scientific research into psychedelics.
Sort of the chemist of the first and second psychedelic renaissances or revolutions, or how you want to call them, both in the 60s, 70s, and now.
Yeah, as is true for Bill Richards, who's also been around for 50 years. some time ago, I looked up one of his first papers, and I think it was 71. So that's 50 years ago.
Yeah,
he was already publishing. So it's great to have those folks on board, but also newer researchers like Katrien Preller or Kim Kuipers of the Maastricht University here in the Netherlands, who are doing really serious, hard scientific research into the effects of psychedelics, how they impact brain structures, cognition, emotions, on a much more basic level.
I wanted to, if anybody's still got a question, now is the moment to ask. We should look at a rapper called Off-Label Substance Use Abroad. Something like that. That's apparently the name of a rapper. I don't know. Off-label substance use. That's
a very off-topic, off-label comment.
That's you never know. It would be it's good to know. Thank you, Joost, for your comments. I want to stress again that ICPR can be watched online live. Go to icpr-conference.com/livestream. Link is in the description, and use the code OpenLive40 for 40 euros off. And I did see someone who said who could not afford it. You can apply maybe still for a scholarship ticket. I'm not sure, is that still open, that you know?
We do have scholarships for specifically focused on participants from the global south, because it's also in terms of sustainability. If people are able to watch it from their homes, we'd like to facilitate that. So there is a process for that, definitely.
Yeah. So please do apply to that if you fall in that category. Great. Thank you so much, Joost. I'm gonna stick around for a little bit more, just by myself, just do a couple of channel updates and tell you what's going on and what's coming. But I want to thank you and see you next week.
Yes, thank you,
at ICPR.
Yeah, we'll see you next Friday.
Yes. Oh yeah, on Friday, because we have a work meeting.
That also, yes.
And a pre-party and an after party. Great.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, see you then. Thank you.
All right, cheers.
Bye. Hey, and thanks for sticking around for a little bit more. I just wanted to wrap this up by doing a short little channel update. Because my uploading always comes in bouts. Sometimes I don't upload for a year, and then there's only 5 videos, like right now. I have been finishing up a bunch of stuff that I've been doing about the Philippines, and I've been cutting some clips from that as well. And I really like the clip that's on my channel about harm reduction in the Philippines. It was a very strange situation. To be in a country that had such a violent drug war, and then be in this sort of one location where they tried alternative approaches, but in such a way that it was very good for community, but didn't necessarily, I wasn't sure if they were really helped substance-wise. Most of the reason why they were there was because they were afraid they would get killed otherwise. So be sure to check that out. I do want to implore you to, actually, if you haven't liked, this is a very late like, but do still like this live stream, and subscribe to this channel. Go to myname.nl, so THYSROES.nl, to check out all my social media. So you can follow me on Twitter and on YouTube, I would say, mostly. Those are the places that I'm at. I am also on Instagram and Facebook. I post on there sporadically. My intent for the next couple of months is to upload more about diverging topics that are not necessarily only drug policy. There is a great story, I think, that I went to do in 2019 about the ingredients for MDMA being sort of plundered from the forests in Cambodia. So I went there to check that out, and it's going to be an interesting video that's more about, in the end, logging and the destruction of rainforests, and less so about MDMA, although you will learn a few things from that as well. Thank you all for being here tonight, and it was super cool talking to you all. And I'd like to leave the door open for a question, if you have one. because otherwise I'll just start popping off. Then you can also, so funny that I forgot these things. This is why my YouTube channel is slow. I have a Patreon. You can support me on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/Thijs, you can follow my personal blog there, where I definitely have been posting more about all the different things that I do in my life. I make a lot of different types of content, and I try to use YouTube as a sort of it's a really great way to talk to a large group of people, and I'm not a big fan of many other social platforms. I like Twitter to sort of like blah blah away, but I don't like Instagram or Facebook that much, and I really like do like YouTube. So I plan to continue doing this for until there's no YouTube anymore. So I'll keep coming back, and I'll catch you there with documentaries, with stories, with clips, anything that sort of goes. So thanks a lot. Hope to see you at ICPR 2022, digitally or in person. And don't forget, if you fill out the code OpenLive40 in the shopping cart of the ICPR web page, then you get 40 euros off. And it's great value, because then you get, for 40 euros a day, you get, you know, about 30 to 40 speakers, so and months worth of content. So I highly recommend you check that out. Hey, thank you all for attending this webinar. I hope this was informative about psilocybin, about possible models for legalization, the crazy sort of gray areas that do exist, and where this might go from here. So catch you at the next one. See ya. Thanks, Damn Strange, for your comments.